Welcome back. In this continuation of Chapter 7, we're going to be moving the game feature that we constructed in the last video into a brand new project. Normally this would be your final project, but since I've already done that in my final project, I'm using a representative test project. So I have simply created a brand new project file using the third-person starter project. So I have that open here. In advance of this video, I went in and enabled the plugins. So the game feature plugin is already enabled, as is the modular gameplay is enabled. So both of those were enabled. I had to restart the project, all the steps that we just discussed in the last video. So now this project is ready to receive any new game feature plugins. One thing I wanted to do right away, because I always forget, is to set up the actors in the core project to receive gameplay features, particularly components. So if you're going to be adding components from a gameplay feature to a core project, those actors need to self-register with the system. So I went ahead and made sure that my third-person character, my player controller, and in this case, my game mode were all pre-registered. So what that basically means is I went into the default character in the third-person program and added a receiver node. So I pulled off get game component framework manager, added the receiver, associated myself to it. That way, when we add components in a game feature, this actor will accept them. I did the same thing for the player controller. So I created a brand new player controller and simply said, I am also a receiver, so I can add components to a controller. And for the game mode, I did the same thing, created it so that they're a receiver. Yeah, if you're doing this exactly following along, then I also changed the player controller class in the game mode to reference this brand new blueprint player controller. On default, it says player controller. So at this stage, all three, the player controller, the game mode, and the third-person character are all active and ready to receive. So with that, the next thing to do is really move or migrate the plugin to this folder. There's two ways you can do that. And largely what I found is it depends on the dependency of your materials and textures. The example I'm going to show you in this video has a tendency to break the texture to material linkage, but it is faster, easier, and quicker. And in this particular plugin, there's not a lot of materials, and therefore it's an easy fix after the fact. If the content that you're migrating is heavily dependent on materials, then you may want to choose the alternate path, which is to create a brand new game feature in this project and then migrate from one content folder to another content folder, which has a higher likelihood of keeping the relationship between the materials and textures. So for this example, we're going to simply copy the folders. So what I'm going to do is jump out to the Explorer, and in my new project, this Move feature project, and then I have my two feature project that we did in our last video. So this one has plugins and has game features and has our test feature set. What we basically want to do is replicate that structure in this project. So under the Move feature, I'm just going to add a new folder called plugins, and you could copy and paste the entire structure, but I find that it's unlikely that you're only going to have one entry. So I'm going to just type these two so that they match. So plugins and game features, capital F, small s. And therefore, I can now take this folder, do a Control C, go up here, do a Control V, and I've copied basically all the content of this folder, which at this point is content, resources, and the plugin data asset. In order for that to be effective in our new project, we first need to, let's shut her down, launch it from scratch. This will allow the editor to see the brand new plugin, but it doesn't automatically enable the new plugin. So when we launch back into our project, because the folder structure exists, it will appear in our plugins, but it is not yet enabled. So we will then go into Edit Plugins and look for our test feature. And so here is the game feature plugin that we just copied and pasted into this project. We can enable it, restart the editor one more time, and we've effectively migrated or moved that game feature content into our new project. At this point, when the editor's done restarting, if you don't see the plugin, it's likely because your settings for your content browser might not include plugin folders. So you would go to Settings, and you would make sure you have Show Plugin Content selected, and therefore you would see this plugin subfolder. So in our case, it works. So here is our new content. And if it is like any other project I've done, the textures, these textures, have their links broken to these materials. And maybe it worked. Let's open this up and see. No, they are broken. So in this case, they're broken. So what I'm going to do is quickly go to the texture folder, select the wood components for this particular plugin. There isn't a whole lot of them, so I'm going to pick the normal, go up here, select this, put the normal in place, and select the base color. Go to the content browser, select the base color, paste the base color in there, and save that. So once I've done that, that will propagate through most of the build components. And it's not a big deal in this kind of project. Again, if your project is heavily dependent on materials and textures, then you may want to choose a migrate path where you open both U projects and you migrate all the assets over, as opposed to the quicker path of just copying and pasting. All right, so our material is fixed, which means our meshes should correct themselves with the proper mesh. Perfect. Good stuff. So all of these now have the right material on them. All right. So with that out of the way, the last sort of migration step is to create components for any of the functionality that are on the primary classes. So those primary classes are typically the player character, the controller, player state, game mode, etc. So in this particular plugin, the character element is already a controller. Or sorry, I say controller, a component. So that's going to be easier to migrate. The game mode has a very small role to play in this particular marketplace asset, in that it's simply spawning a save game manager. So the game mode on begin play spawns in a save manager, which it then stores in its variables. We would have to move this to a component and then take that component and add it to the game mode. So that would be a step we would do to replicate this logic. So let's fix the character logic first. So we have this component that is attached to the character. And you can see that by looking at the example project and looking at the third person character in the example project. And you will see that it has standard input bindings, which we really don't care about because we're going to use the enhanced input binding. So those we don't really care about. It has this little piece of code, which we do care about. And it has this AC builder component already attached to the third person character. So the way we're going to move this over is we're going to use the game feature data asset to attach this to any characters in the core project. So let's do that. We're going to go to the root folder. We're going to open the data asset. We're going to move it out of the active state. So in this case, we're going to go to registered, and we're going to add a new action. And that new action is going to be to add a component. Then we'll expand this out. And the component we're going to do is we're going to look for anything that has a BP third person character, which is the character in the main project. And we're going to add the builder component both on the client and the server. So that will enable that to happen. We're going to hit save. And effectively what that does is replace this reference here. Now we still have to deal with this part of the marketplace asset where the follow camera from the character is fed into the building component. In order to do that effectively in a game feature, what we're going to do is go to the component. And in the component itself, what happens is on begin play, which I need to find, on begin play, give ourselves a little bit of room here. When the components begin play occurs, we're going to, we already have it here, get the owner, cast to BP third person character. We're going to cast that to the third person character. And we're pretty confident that will be okay because when we added this component, we said add it to every BP third person character. We're going to get the follow camera off of that. And then we have to, we have to initialize the builder component. So initialize builder component. And I, of course, never give myself enough room. Drag that a little bit further. And we're going to put the follow camera here. So what we've effectively done is moved logic that was in the character class on begin play and did the exact same thing in the component, which is a better way, since we're adding this component, to anything of a BP third person character or child thereof. So the plugin says you're going to add that to BP third person character, which is why I'm confident that this component will only be found on that. But any children of that will also get this builder component. So now we have the character initializing the building component with the appropriate setup. We have it being added to the third person character. So I think we're good. We've replicated the functionality off of the character. And if I hit play, I did not get what I thought. So when that occurs, it is likely that you have to stop and start the engine. So we're going to do that right now. Okay, as expected, a restart of the editor fixed the problem. So if we play, you'll see that the builder bar shows up and We've got some texture references that have been lost in the actual keys, but the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 would enable us to actually build something. So this proves that the AC builder component is now attached to our in-game character class. And just as a quick recap, the issue is that anytime you change this asset, it seems to either require an editor restart or some magic combination of those buttons in order to have it execute. So I find if you're ever changing this, you're likely just need to do a quick restart of the editor, and then everything seems to work fine. All right, so our character has been, the building component is now added to our character. Many of these components are not character specific, they're kind of world specific. Though when you do get to their player controller, so if I open the player controller, you'll note that in this sample marketplace asset, all of the key bindings of the example content is here. So when we press any individual key, such as H to hide the debug, G to force a connectivity check, E to loop, or Shift E to loop through the sockets, all of that logic is in the game controller. We don't actually want to do it this way in our final project. If we did, we'd move all of this into a component and then simply add that component to the player controller. But in our case, what we're going to want to do is we will end up creating, we will end up creating input actions for each of the activities that we want to perform. So we would, let me just copy that one. We might create one for place piece. We might create one for rotate piece. So once we do those, we'll follow the Lyra standard of creating a corresponding input mapping context, so that we would have all of the input mapping context. We would create the playable mappable context for those various inputs so that they could appear in our settings screen. And then we'll move all of the various logic that is contained within this player controller. We'll basically dissect each one of these pieces of logic into a gameplay ability. So our end design will be each of the logic components that are here in this marketplace asset. We're going to compartmentalize and modularize and place it inside a gameplay ability, and then associate that gameplay ability the same way we've been doing with our ability systems, between an input action and the gameplay ability. So I'm not actually going to go through each and every one of these in this example project, because that's not how we're going to do it inside of a live project. But to summarize the basic activities here, we take the character classes that are in the main project, and in this case, that is the third-person player character, the game mode, and the player controller. In each one of those, we need to make sure that they are listening to the game framework component manager and registering themselves as a receiver of that. And in the plugin, in our data asset, we're going to add components. So if I were to do what I said we're not going to do, is replicate this input logic that they have in the player controller, I would go ahead and create a new blueprint actor component, and I'd call it the player controller component. Probably not a good name. I would move the logic out of the player controller into this player controller component, do whatever we needed to do inside this component. And then I would edit the component list to say, in addition to adding the AC builder to the third-party person character, I'm going to add the for the player controller, I want you to add the player controller component, and that would encapsulate all of that logic in the player controller. Anything I wanted to move from, oops, that is not what I wanted to do. Then I would add another entry into this array and say for the game mode, I didn't actually create that. So here I would have another actor component, and I would call it the game mode component. And then in the, dismiss that. And here I would have my game mode component. So I basically, in the game feature, define each of these components to their corresponding actors. And then I would move from the marketplace asset any logic that was native to the character class or controller class or game mode class into the component. And that gives us modularity. So in this example, what I would do is say, all right, the game mode has one thing on begin play. So I'm just going to grab that, copy it, move to the game mode component, which is this one. And off of begin play, I would do the same thing. So you basically would reconstruct the logic that is dependent upon core actors into a component. And this doesn't exist, so we're going to create the variable so that you don't have to hard code this logic inside the game mode. Instead, the game feature injects whatever this component is onto the actor as opposed to hard coding it. So this creates a loosely coupled relationship between the third-party game mode and my new game mode component so that I can add whatever I need building-wise into that component. Many of these other classes that come along with the marketplace asset are not related to an individual actor that is like the character or the controller, etc. They're freestanding objects, and those are fine, and they can stay in here. So the last thing I would do before calling this kind of moved and ready to move onward is I'd probably go in and like blow away the maps. I'd get rid of any references to the third-party character and the mannequin. And I would leave ourselves with basically materials, meshes, textures, and the blueprint components. So that's what we're going to do when we pick this up inside our master project. You'll see that I've basically done what I just said. I've removed any classes that are not relevant, and I've set it up so that we can use the enhanced inputs and gameplay abilities. So in our third installment in this chapter, we're going to pick it up there and complete the process.